Hey, welcome back, everybody. We've got quite a treat for you today, answering the question that's at the front of many of our minds. Is America a Christian nation? It can be a difficult question because we tend to ask it with different presuppositions in mind and different ideas of what constitutes a Christian nation. Are we talking about the founders' personal faith, the laws on the books, the culture in the streets? Does a Christian nation mean a nation full of Christians, or a nation built on a Christian vision of man, government, and law? Or perhaps a little bit of both. And I'll say this, you aren't in this episode going to get a simple yes or no answer with nice, tidy, bulletproof facts in the first 2 minutes of the show to own the libs with facts and logic, right? That's the goal, but we need to explore American history to answer the question. America's colonial founding, its relationship to Christianity, the Revolution, the Great Awakening, and so much more. And here, as our resident expert to do just that, is Dr. Sam Smith, a historian, the chair of Liberty University's History Department, and the interim dean of Liberty's College of Arts and Sciences, with a focus on early American religious history, so few are more qualified from an academic standpoint to weigh in on this. And one of his irrelevant credentials is that he's my own flesh and blood. He's my uncle. So Uncle Sam, Dr. Sam, I guess for the purposes of this interview, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Addison. It's great to be with you.
You know, when I called you and asked you to do this, you sent me an email with some categories to help frame this issue, which I found was very helpful. So we'll take them one by one, starting with the colonial foundations of America. Before we had the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and even before we had a declared nation, we had colonial settlers, 13 colonies. How did Christianity shape the political culture of colonial America at that time?
Yeah, that's right. When you think about, and I like the way you put it at the beginning, that it is a multi-layered question, and you really do have to go back to the colonial period. Just like the book of Genesis, for example, is the seedbed of theology in the Bible, colonial America is the seedbed of American history. And so when you look at the founding purposes of the 13 colonies, they were almost without exception exclusively Christian. Now, we're familiar with the Mayflower Compact, the Massachusetts Bay Charter, and we know that the Puritans were, heavily influenced by covenant theology, and that the scriptures really regulated what they did. Both the Pilgrims and the Puritans Massachusetts Bay Puritans that came 10 years later. But there are other colonists that sometimes we don't think about. Early on in Virginia, the Virginia Charter of 1606, if you read the charter, it has a very evangelistic focus. The focus was to come and to convert the natives, to come and establish Christianity. And of course, Virginia established the Anglican Church early on. So a lot of times historians will just place the Virginia as sort of a secular founding, but it was far from that. And there are other colonies as well. South Carolina, for example, its founding constitution of 1669, called the Fundamental Constitutions, which was actually written largely by John Locke, had a very strong Christian gospel message centered in. If you read the fundamental constitutions, that was very open to other things, but it stressed the intention of wooing people to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Also think of Rhode Island. Now we think of Rhode Island as, religious liberty. Roger Williams is sort of couched as that ahead of the curve on things like religious liberty, and that he was getting away from a Christian foundation. Far from it. If you read the Rhode Island Charter of 1663, it specifically states that the purpose of Rhode Island was to enhance and these are almost exact words, the whole of Christianity. And so you could
And
go on
and
in various
the
different
same thing
places.
applies. Yeah, the same thing applies with you mentioned the Mayflower Compact. It says in the Mayflower Compact that the purpose of coming here was for the glory of God and the advancement of Christianity. You had in early colonial America, I think 9 or 11 of the 13 colonies required you to make a public profession of faith, Christian faith specifically, to hold office. There were blasphemy laws in colonial America. And I think you told me this before the interview. They also mandated church attendance in early colonial America, and they would go door to door on Sundays to make sure that people were not at home but were at church.
And they did that even in places that you may not expect. Virginia, South Carolina had church wardens that would go around early on and make sure people were attending church, etc. So, and Pennsylvania, William Penn's Charter of Privileges of 1701 specifically states that you had to believe in Jesus Christ to hold public office in Pennsylvania. So I guess the point here, Addison, is this. It is utterly impossible to separate this colonial period from the early national period. These people didn't just suddenly change with the American Revolution and the early national period. This mindset carried into the Revolution. It carried into the early national period, and it was deeply influenced by Christianity in the founding of all the 13 colonies.
And we'll get into it more later in the interview. When the colonial settlers came here and leading up to the revolution, when we talk about religious liberty, because we'll hear that all the time. Oh, the founders had it so in mind. They were obsessed with this goal of letting Muslim Islamist militants come to America and share in this great vision. It was actually arguably more denominational, and we'll get into that. But we can't get to that point without talking about first the Great Awakening here in America, one of the greatest religious movements ever on the face of the earth. So we will talk about that right after a quick break. All right, Dr. Smith. Feels a little weird saying that, not Uncle Sam. But let's talk about the Great Awakening, because a lot of historians will focus on the Enlightenment era as laying the groundwork for America's independence. Locke's ideas on natural law and social contract, the separation of powers from Montesquieu. But I know you firmly believe the Great Awakening doesn't get near enough credit for preparing the colonies for independence and eventually the official American founding. So tell us about that.
That's right. John Adams said that for the American Revolution to be successful, it was like 13 clocks had to strike at the same time. You have to remember, these were colonies. This was not a nation as such yet. And so there had to be a networking mechanism. There had to be something that could wed the colonies together with a single purpose. And that event, I believe, was the Great Awakening. When you look at George Whitefield, when you look at, for example, how he traveled to all the different colonies, and he was written about in all of the papers virtually. And he became what was many believe the most famous man in the world, except for possibly King George III. And this awakening, which was a gospel-centered focus, mostly from Reformed thinkers like George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and others, it brought the colonies together toward a particular unified purpose. Now, I've never been one that said that the Great Awakening caused the American Revolution. I don't believe that. It happened too many years before the Revolution. But I like what historian Christine Hireman at the University of Delaware says. She says the Great Awakening was the dress rehearsal for the American Revolution. And I think that's spot on. When you think about what the Great Awakening did. It challenged the norms of authority. So, for example, George Whitefield would preach outdoors. He would, sometimes defy religious establishment, and he was an Anglican himself. But there was a certain revolutionary language that came out of the Great Awakening that people adopted. And I think one of the best examples of this revolutionary language you can read in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, 1776, which is really the most important document to get a lot of people who were on the fence and to adopt the idea of independence. And if you read Common Sense, it reads like an awakening sermon. Common Sense was written to be read out loud, and it was read out loud. It was passed out to all the lower houses of assemblies, and people read it. And if you read Common Sense, he uses the Bible throughout. Now, Thomas Paine, later we find out, was really not an evangelical Christian, but he understood his audience. He understood the value of sermonic language, and it comes right out of the Great Awakening. And so a lot of the political sermons, for example, that were preached by people like Jonathan Mayhew and others, were like awakening sermons, calling for a conversion to independence, etc. So the Christian ethos, I guess you could say, that comes out of the Great Awakening goes right into the American Revolution and informs it heavily.
And I don't think people understand the magnitude of the Great Awakening at its time. That one of the sad things about history is the further we get away from it, the more people forget about it. But if you go back and put yourself in the age of the Great Awakening, George Whitefield was drawing crowds of 30, the estimates range, but 30, 40, 50, 60,000. And he wasn't just preaching in America. He was going overseas to places like London and drawing these massive crowds that would make Trump blush compared to a Trump rally, especially when you compare it to the population at the time. What does that say about the magnitude of the Great Awakening? What could it be compared to, if anything, in modern day America or the modern day world?
Yeah, it's hard to. I tell students that George Whitefield was the Billy Graham of his era in many ways. Of course, Billy Graham, preached to 1 million people at one time in South Korea. Now, George Whitefield didn't preach to that many people, but like you say, he preached to massive crowds. Benjamin Franklin, who was his friend, while he was preaching in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin did a little bit of a calculation. He was always doing that. And he calculated how much space a person could comfortably stand and listen. And he drew a circumference and he threw in mathematical formulas, doing this while Whitefield was preaching a sermon. And he estimated that in that spot outside, 30,000 people could hear him as he preached at one time. Now, 30,000 people, that's an enormous crowd. Whitefield preached to 20,000 people in Boston Commons once. I found something, Addison, that really astounded me in my research when I was at the University of South Carolina. I was researching these crowds that you mentioned, George Whitefield, and he was preaching in Charleston, South Carolina. And the crowd was 4,000 people. Now I thought, well, that's kind of a small crowd, comparatively speaking. And then I decided to look up the population of Greater Charleston at that time. And could you believe it? The population was 4,000 people, which means basically everybody in Charleston and the surrounding area went to hear George Whitefield preach. That really was astounding to me.
The dress rehearsal for the American Revolution, I really like that language. And now we'll get to the actual play, the American Revolution. We'll take a quick break and get into that. All right, welcome back. We are answering the question to the best of our ability: is America a Christian nation? We've talked about America's colonial roots, thoroughly Christian roots, the religious tests and mandates that came with being a colony in colonial America. We talked about the dress rehearsal for the American Revolution, the Great Awakening. Now we'll talk about the actual American Revolution and how Christianity is inseparable from it. Dr. Smith, the biblical ideas, how did the biblical ideas of Protestant resistance theory, you know, the question of when, if ever, it's lawful, it's moral for Christians to resist a tyrannical ruler, how did that shape the revolutionary generation's understanding of liberty and resistance to tyranny?
It had a huge impact. Protestant resistance theory had a huge impact on the American Revolution. You know, today when I guess modern Christians read Romans 13, they read it on the surface and conclude, well, it's just, you just can't resist, you know, the government if they're being ungodly, if they're being tyrannical, etc. But that's really not what Paul is getting at in Romans 13. And a lot of the Protestant thinkers understood this. John Calvin, for example, in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, pointed out that through the lesser magistrate, there could be resistance, that the lesser magistrate had a responsibility not to let the ruler run roughshod over the people. John Knox preached the same thing. Martin Luther did. And, you know, in 1550, you had a document called the Magdeburg Confession. It was 9 ministers in the town of Magdeburg, Germany, when there was an attempt to reintroduce Catholic rule in Germany. They stood up against that and wrote the Magdeburg Confession. And this is part of these early Protestant resistance theory documents, which focus on the lesser magistrate. And it's very exegetical and very focused on the Bible, showing how that Romans 13 and other passages do not mean that you can just let governments do whatever they want to do against Christian principles, etc. Even the Geneva Bible of 1560, the Geneva Bible was really the first study Bible. It was the Bible that the Puritans used. And they had notes. It had notes in the Geneva Bible, and it outlined a lot of these Protestant resistance theory principles in it. Fun fact, one of the reasons that you get the King James Version, and I love the King James Version, but one of the reasons the King James Version came about was because King James did not like the Geneva Bible because it called into question the divine right of kings. And so the Geneva Bible is part of that Protestant resistance theory. You have other documents like a Huguenot document that came out after St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre of 1572, a document called Vindice contra Tyrannus, 1579, which was, again, a Protestant resistance theory that outlines specific biblical principles for godly resistance. Samuel Rutherford, a Scottish Calvinist minister, wrote a document called Lex Rex in 1644. The same thing. And so our founders read these documents. Here, I found this statement by Thomas Cooper. Now, Thomas Cooper was really not a Christian, so far as we know, and he was a friend of Thomas Jefferson. He was an intellectual. He was a professor at the University of Virginia early on. He was also a professor at the University of South Carolina early on. In fact, the library at South Carolina is named after the Thomas Cooper Library. But he told Thomas Jefferson in a letter in the 1820s, he said, without Vindice contra Tyrannus and without Lex Rex, John Locke would not have written the things that he wrote. In other words, Protestant resistance theory carried into John Locke's treatises on government and his ideas of the compacts of government and so forth. So you see covenant theology, Reformed theology carrying into documents written by some of these, what we call Enlightenment thinkers. But a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers were heavily influenced by Protestant resistance theory. So, the
And so
American Revolution.
you mentioned you mentioned that these are the men, these are the documents that our founders, the men who fought and bled and died for this country, they were informed by this reading of Romans 13, or this concept of we must obey God rather than man. The moment that man tramples our God-given rights and duties, we actually have a mandate to defy them.
Yes.
Is that fair to say that was the mindset that the founders were coming from that sparked the revolution?
Right, and we're gonna. I think we might talk about the seal that Jefferson supported, but it said on the earliest proposed Great Seal of the United States was rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. And that's actually a quotation from John Knox. And so, yeah, it was part and parcel to their thinking about what they were doing. And so, for example, it's not a mistake that the British called the American Revolution Old Oliver's Cause. Now, that was going back to the English Revolution of the 1640s, Oliver Cromwell. Of course, that was really a war between the Puritans and the Cavaliers. It was a religious war. And they were saying the American Revolution is a religious war. And George III called the American Revolution that Presbyterian War. And so it's just everywhere, Addison, these Christian principles infusing the American Revolution and how they thought about the American Revolution. And it's really, you really can't escape it.
Right. Well, you mentioned the Great Seal. We will get to that after a quick break. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to talk about the Great Seal. The seal that you're used to seeing is E pluribus unum. I think we might have a picture of it, but a seal that's often overlooked in American history is this one, the one that's on screen right now. Dr. Smith, explain to us what we are seeing and how that fits in with this notion of a Christian America.
Yes, this is really remarkable. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin in 1776 were placed on a commission to adopt a seal. And this is what they came up with. And of course, if you look at it, it is the picture of Pharaoh's army being destroyed in the Red Sea, and Moses and the children of Israel standing there, and then you have the pillar of fire in the background. And of course, it says, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God," a quote from John Knox. Imagine, I mean, most people today, especially secular historians, they paint Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin as deists at best and as irreligious founders. That's really not true. I'm not saying they were evangelical Christians, but they were heavily influenced by Christian principles. And I think you can see it here.
If a seal like that, I just have to say, if a seal like that was to be proposed today by say Donald Trump as our new Great Seal, yeah, he would be called a Christian fascist.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, here is a profound biblical scene that the two men who people today paint as the most secular founders were advocating for. If that does not tell you that there's deep Christian principles in the founding of this country, I really don't know what else does. I mean, it is now this seal was not adopted eventually, but it is telling that Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin were advocates for this seal. I think that is a powerful point that people should bring up. I actually have this seal in a flag form hanging in my office. And it's a great conversation piece too.
And John Adams, didn't he also sign off on that seal?
I'd have to double check on that. I think he did, but I'm not sure about that.
So we have rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. We have Pharaoh's army drowning in the sea. And when you look at this and how it fits into the context of the American Revolution, I mean, real quickly, how do secular historians look at everything that we're talking about and thoroughly deny or maybe thoroughly downplay the role of Christianity in America's founding? I mean, how can you look at this seal and just shrug your shoulders at it?
It really is a problem in the historical textbooks and historical classrooms where oftentimes these things are just papered over. They're ignored. It doesn't fit the narrative per se. And so, I mean, good historians know that these things exist, but they choose not to focus on them because it doesn't fit the narrative of a secular founding. And that is the narrative, that it is a secular founding, not a Christian founding. And it's incorrect. And there's good historians, though, I will say, who are not necessarily Christian, who have recognized this and who understand the deep impact of Christianity in America. But by and large, I'm sorry to say, most of the historians in the higher academic echelons more or less look over these things. They don't directly deny them per se that they exist, but they overlook them.
Mm-hmm. And give too much credit, which we'll talk about after this break, to the Enlightenment. So stick around for that. Well, we talked a little bit about the Enlightenment earlier, Dr. Smith. Locke and Montesquieu's work was the North Star is the narrative, that religion was a private matter, didn't really pull any weight in our founding documents of the formation of the country. And you say that there's an Enlightenment myth in American history. What do you mean?
That's right. And I don't mean that the Enlightenment does not have profound impacts in the founding. It does, but it has been overplayed to the point where I call it the Enlightenment myth. So here's an example. A lawyer scholar, Stephen Green, not the singer, but a lawyer scholar who wrote a book called The Inventing a Christian America. He argues that none of the literature really points to a Christian founding, that it is strictly a secular founding. Another historian, Isaac Cramnett, wrote a book called The Godless Constitution. He argues the same thing. So there was a political scientist at the University of Houston, a man by the name of Donald Lutz, who examined 15,000 books and pamphlets during the Revolutionary era. 15,000. Now that's a lot. I'm sure he had a lot of graduate students helping him. And meticulously went through all of these to see who was cited, who's citing who, anything that had to do with politics, the revolution, the Constitution, etc. During that whole period from the late 1700s into the 1800s, 15,000 books and pamphlets. And listen to what he discovered. He discovered that the Bible was far and away the most cited source in these books. He also found that the book of Deuteronomy was cited 2 times more than John Locke. Just the book of Deuteronomy, 2 times more than John Locke. The Apostle Paul was cited as many times as Montesquieu and as many times as Blackstone. And now other historians have come behind Donald Lutz. And by the way, this is in a book called The Origins of American Constitutionalism. Other historians have come behind Donald Lutz, Mark Hall and Daniel Dreisbach, and they have pointed out that Lutz's numbers are actually kind of conservative. They found more since Lutz wrote this book. So the idea that the Enlightenment was the dominant theme, the North Star, as you mentioned, is a myth. The most influential text in the Revolutionary period was, without question, the Bible. And this has been pointed out with evidence, and it's irrefutable evidence, actually. So it just took somebody going through that many. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I love that framing. The Bible, 66 books, one book, 1/66 of the Bible is cited more in the 15,000 founding documents than the star of the Enlightenment. I mean, what else do you need to know?
Yeah, 34% of all the citations in those 15,000 documents were from the Bible. Only 22% from all of the Enlightenment thinkers combined. And so the numbers are clearly in the favor of a Christian founding when you look at that. So
scoreboard. That's all I'll say on that. Some actually assume some will assume, talking about religious liberty too, that the founding secular, and that even the concept of religious liberty is secular, like a Jeffersonian deistic project that downplays evangelical Christianity in American society. Tell us why that notion is wrong, even relating to religious liberty.
Yeah, that's right. Jefferson, people look to Jefferson, of course, his letter to the Danbury Baptists and the separation of church and state, and how the Supreme Court took that up and misinterpreted what Jefferson was saying. And they have come to the point where they say that, the idea of religious liberty as a secular shows that America is a secular nation. In fact, that's not true. When you look at the history of the development of religious liberty, when you look at, for example, early Baptists like Isaac Backus and John Leland, who really stressed religious liberty, it was more about, and we talked about this earlier, I would say it was more about denominational liberty. In other words, Presbyterians not telling Baptists what they can do, and Anglicans not telling Methodists what they can do, etc. That they were talking about religious liberty in the context, in many ways, of denominations, not as we today are thinking that religious liberty means you can just let any community have anything that they want religiously, even if it runs roughshod over the rights of other Christians, etc. That's why, for example, I don't know if most people realize this, the first non-Christian place of worship, other than Jewish synagogues. Now, Jewish synagogues were established early on in colonial America, even as early as the 1650s, and South Carolina had a Jewish synagogue in the 1740s. Other than Jewish synagogues, the first non-Christian place of worship established was not until 1850, and that was in San Francisco. It was actually a Buddhist temple in 1850. But even more striking is the first mosque that was ever built was not built until the 1920s in America. Can you imagine that? Not built until the 1920s. So it was in the 20th century before non-Christian places of worship were established. Now, what's the point of that? I'm not here to say we shouldn't, allow different religions to have their churches in our modern day. That's not what I'm here to say. I am here to say that we ought to look back to the history that America's Christian founding, it was, as Earl Warren, who was a very liberal Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said, America was a Christian land for Christian people. And that's Earl Warren. He said that in a speech in 1954. And he was one of the more kind of liberal Chief Justices of the Supreme Court. The point is, people understood the Christian roots of America at one time, even as early as the 1950s. I don't think people understand that today. We've been so secularized through our school systems, et cetera, that we're really not paying attention to history. Now, back to this idea of religious liberty. People like Isaac Backus and John Leland, they're very clear they want a Christian land. They want a Christian government. But what they're after is they understand that true Christianity requires volition. In other words, you cannot force a person to be a believer in Jesus Christ. It's just false. You can't force them to do that. And that was the point that a lot of these early Baptists were trying to make. And that's the context of religious liberty that they're proposing. So I would say that religious liberty, far from being a secular principle, is a principle of Christian doctrine, that understands that salvation cannot be forced. And that's how I think we need to come back to the idea of religious liberty in America.
Well, and we've been teasing this question: is America a Christian nation? The entire episode. So we're going to answer that question after this break. All right, welcome back, everybody. You've been wanting to get the point blank answer to this the whole time. I still don't know if you're going to get it point blank, yes or no. But Dr. Sam Smith, this has been an awesome, very informative episode. I wish we could go on for hours. But I'll just ask you point blank, as an expert in early religious American history, is America a Christian nation?
Here's the way I would answer that, Addison, and I get this question a lot from students. If you mean, did America have a Christian founding? Then yes, I would say America was founded as a Christian nation. Do I believe that the Constitution established some sort of a Christian-only theocracy? No. When you read the Constitution, you really just don't. You really don't see that. George Washington in 1790 wrote a letter of tolerance, so to speak, to a Jewish synagogue in New York, and you really can't say Christian nation in the strictest sense of the term that the Constitution was establishing a Christian-only nation. It didn't do that. But that's not the point. I use the term Christian nation. Sometimes I'll say America was founded as a Christian nation. And by that I mean it had a deep, deep Christian influence, Christian founding. So I prefer the idea America had a Christian founding rather than just saying America had a Christian nation. I don't think that's an incorrect thing to say, that America was founded as a Christian nation. I just like to nuance it a little bit and explain what I mean. And so, for example, if you look at the Constitution of the United States, it's heavily influenced by covenant theology. It's a contract with the people. It's a covenant with the people. And this goes all the way back to Christian theology, covenant theology. There are little hints in the Constitution about Christian principles, the year of our Lord, referring to Jesus Christ. Or, when the president had 10 days to veto a bill and return it or whatever. He had 10 days, but it says excepting Sunday. So it was a recognition of Sunday as the Lord's day. So you see some of those hints. But beyond that, I like to focus on statements, say, for example, John Adams, who said that our Constitution was written only for a religious people. That if you were not a religious people, and he meant by that a Christian people, the Constitution really did not work the way it should have worked, that it could work. And so the Constitution itself is seen as more or less a secular document, but it's not. For example, the Constitution establishes federalism. Or what is federalism? Federalism developed out of this Protestant resistance theory. It developed especially from a German Calvinist political scientist named Johannes Althusius in the 1600s. He's called the father of modern federalism. He was a Calvinist political thinker, and he developed the idea of the separation of powers, and he developed it directly from the Bible. And so the Constitution is about the separation of powers. It establishes a federal system. Why is that important? Because these American Christian founders, many of them, understood that you did not want to put all the power in one place. That's what socialism does. That's what communism does. It puts power in the center. And the federal system divided the power. It scattered it out among the states, in the counties, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, the executive branch. It's a division of power for a purpose. And the reason they divided power is that they understood that man was a sinner. And if you put all the power in one place, bad people will take advantage of that. That's why Madison said that if men were angels, there would be no need for government. And he understood that men were not angels, that they were sinners, and they needed certain governing principles for a society to be bound together in mutual understanding. And these are principles from Christianity. You do not have, I would say, the Constitution of the United States without the history of Christianity. It would never have been produced had it not been for the Christian scriptures and Christian principles and influences.
Yeah, James Madison, that's the Federalist Papers. It's one of my favorite, it's why James Madison's one of my favorite founders. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither internal nor external controls would be necessary. And that whole concept is essentially, it's a biblical principle that says, hey, if man cannot discipline himself enough to and have the restraint to obey God and to follow Christ, how in the world is he going to have the context and the language to obey and to govern anyone else? It's impossible without that framework. Dr. Smith, I wish we could go on. We're all out of time. Thank you so much for this very insightful conversation.
Thank you, Addison. I enjoyed it.